So first up today, we have Sam Brady, who's a PhD student with the University of Glasgow, to talk about organising and using the Paralympic collections. So over to you, Sam.
Great, thank you. I had to figure out where my mouse was to unmute myself. Okay, I'm just gonna share my presentation. And can everyone see that okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So yes, hi, my name is Sam. Just a quick visual description. I'm a white cisgendered man with black facial hair, black head hair and glasses. I'm wearing like I guess like a purplish shirt, and I'm sitting in front of some bookcases. So this talk will be focusing on some collections relating to Paralympic and disability sport history, drawing off my involvement with them in a research and voluntary capacity. As Alistair mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow, but I'm also working with the Paralympic Heritage Trust, or the MPHT, or the Trust, as I'll refer to it. And I'm undertaking a collaborative project concerning the social, political and technological history of sports wheelchairs. I'm not an archivist, but I took a 6-month placement as part of my PhD, specifically working on the Wheel Power collection, which is an ongoing project with the MPHT, which I will speak to later in the presentation. And I've also been involved in kind of creating more history materials and kind of using archival materials in some more public-facing projects. So this presentation will be just kind of a broad overview of all of these things, and hopefully it will be interesting for all of you. So collections contain referring to disability sport, and by disability sport I'm really referring to sports people who with physical impairments, so wheelchair users, visually impaired people, amputees, etc. These collections really vary in scope and scale. When the Paralympic Heritage Trust was established in 2015, there was a scoping report which found lots of different collections pertaining to disability sport history across museums, local authority archives, charities and museums, and of course sport organisations. And that's all across the UK. Internationally, there's also organisations like the International Paralympic Committee and the US Olympic and Paralympic Museum. So there's a real variety of organisations which hold on to what we would think of as disability sport collections. It's also worth noting that that's the macro scale. We also have some really micro scale collections. A lot of athletes will hold on to memorabilia. Their families will hold on to memorabilia, and that will stay within the family. And then also there's researchers like Dr. Ian Britton who kind of have their own personal collection. So we really have like a whole range of scale when it comes to disability sport collections. But again, for the sake of the presentation, I'll be focusing on the work of the NPHT, as these are the collections that I have the most familiarity with. So to focus initially on their own collection, this is a collection amassed primarily from athletes and from organisations like the British Paralympic Association. The collection is primarily object focused. So one example I like to use is clothing. Here we have 2 jackets. On the right is, sorry, on the left is a green jacket from the 64 games in Tokyo, and the one on the right is a kind of a blue and gold blaze, a jacket from the 2020 games in Tokyo. These are both opening ceremony jackets, and I think that they form a nice contrast because aside from change in fashion and materials, you can also see a change in kind of the economic circumstances, right? Because these the 2020 ones were made by ASOS, so like a major clothing brand, where the 2020 ones were just like these little patches they put on kind of random blazers. So it really shows like the evolution of the sport in that way. This slide kind of shows some more general items you might associate with sport collections. So at the bottom we have some trophies, were won by Paralympic archerwoman Anik in 1982. There are some gold medals, so there's a gold and 2 silver medals above that, one in the 1976 games by Hazel Randall. And there's a collection of these cloth pennants, which kind of from a variety of games here, from Paralympic fencer Janet Swan. And I really like these because they're not just from the Paralympic games, they're from like a whole variety of disability sport events. And I like it because you can kind of see like this person's career kind of in a way over through these cloth items. The Trust collection also contains some equipment. So on display here are 3 wheelchairs, and given my PhDs about sports wheelchairs, obviously I have a particular interest in these. So the one in the middle of the left-hand picture is a tennis wheelchair. I couldn't get a close photo of it in time for this, which was used by Peter Norfolk OVE in 2008, and that's like a relatively modern racing a tennis wheelchair. It's got quite cambered wheels. It's got a higher seating position, a lower back. Whereas we compare this to the racing wheelchair, which is on the right side of the screen, which is from the 1980. It was from 1984, and you can see this is very different from what you might see in like a modern wheelchair. It's got shorter front. It's got 2 front wheels, not 1 large front wheel, and the seating position's all different. And it's I like this to compare these, because it really shows how the technology evolved and implies kind of how the sport's changed as part of that. But yeah, so beyond its own collection, the MPHT kind of helps out on 2 other projects as well, which are ongoing with the Buckinghamshire Archives, the local archive service in our area. So one of these is the Wheel Power collection, which I'll speak to briefly in a second, and then also the IWAS collection. So Wheel Power is the organisation that is the UK national body for wheelchair sport, I should say, whereas IWAS is like the international sports body for sports for athletes with physical impairments. And these are both 2 really important organisations, and therefore their collections are really valuable to start looking at when considering these histories. So in the IWAS collection, just for example, we have the cord. The cord is a kind of a pamphlet made by those with spinal cord injuries at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in beginning in 1947. It ran until, I want to say, the late 80s or early 80s even. And the image on the right shows that there are just these kind of single issue kind of pamphlets, but the IWAS collection also has these bounded versions, these hardback versions that you can see on the left side of the screen. And I just think they're really neat that they're these single pamphlets are just like bound together. And what's really important about the cord is that it shows the evolution of not just the sport, of course, at Stoke Mandeville, but also the way that say political issues affecting disabled people, or advice about equipment or independent living was written about by kind of patients themselves, by disabled people themselves. I think it's a really great resource, which unfortunately, and I'll get into this a bit later, like hasn't been fully digitized or utilized yet. Just jumping back to this slide, I'll just talk briefly about the Wheel Power collection, because that's the collection that I have the most familiarity with. I started a archival placement with the MPHT in November 2021. And as part of that, I was really helping out a currently ongoing project to archive the Wheel Power collection. This is overseen between the MPHT and the Buckinghamshire Archives, and it's led by archivist Rosanna Ritchie, who I believe is in the room today, so hi. And you know, a very small amount of work had been done on this collection, but it is essentially a cupboard full of things that needed to be sorted out. So between November when I started and kind of April, May when I left the trust, I'm still working with them. We kind of jumped from about 10 boxes that have been box listed to about 55. So you can see on this photo here that it was in a bit of a state, to put nicely. On the right hand side image, you can see there are some boxes which have the white label, but like still that these all really needed to be sorted out. And come to June, it's going to move. There we go. It's now a lot more organized, and we've really made, well, I say Rosanna's made some really wonderful progress with it. And I should also note that it's not just the physical boxing up, but also the you know, the admin and the preservation work and everything else that went into this. So it's been a really big project, but there's still lots of work to do, of course. So I kind of want to just focus on some items that I picked out from the Wheel Power collection, because it's similar to the IWAS collection in terms of its focus on documents, photos, books, etc. But there are still some more unique objects in there. And as part of that, I'll talk about some of the ways that I've used them in my own work. So on the left-hand side, we have a green rule book from the 1918 Arnhem Games in the Netherlands. Now, for me, this is a really important resource because in these rule books, you can see regulations regarding wheelchair technology. And given my research is about the way that wheelchair technology changed over time, these are incredibly valuable to me. There are a number of other rule books. And you can find that this is in a nice little slipcase type thing. And these are really important for researchers because you can just see the development of these sports on a really granular level. You can see how these rules changed every 4 years. So these are really useful. And then on the right side, we have the British Paraplegic Sports Society, their kind of executive council minute meetings from the mid-70s. Now, as you might have noticed, there are just a lot of organizations and acronyms in these histories, and having the kind of rule books, these minute books are really useful because you kind of get to see this kind of more administrative side of things. And there are loads of these in the Wheel Power collection that, again, could really benefit from things like digitization. Moving forward, we have things like this rehabilitation journal here, which really highlights the medical focus that you can see within the archive. I get a little strange about referring to this specifically as a sports collection, because obviously by nature of the development of these sports coming from hospitals, from rehabilitation units, there is a very distinct medical history here. And I think that we should recognize that while something is a sports collection, it is also a medical collection, a disability collection, and even a charity collection, as I'll get onto it in a sec. So it's just like amalgamation of things, and yeah, there is a big medical presence in the Wheel Power collection. On the charity aspect, this flyer on the right hand of the screen is by a precursor to Wheel Power, the British Wheelchair Sports Foundation, and I highlight this just because there are loads of these like kind of calls for funding kind of advertisement flyers, and I imagine there would be some very interesting opportunities to look at the way that disability was spoken about through different campaigns and how this changed over time. That's something that I have time for currently, but in the future, you never know. Just quickly, some other things. There's a British Empire Medal from Paralympian Gwen Buck. And then there's also these commemorative stamps from Sochi in 2014. I only can recognize one of the people on there, Sir Lutford Gutman, in the kind of green section. I don't know about the others, but if anyone else knows, let us know. And so these are two things that I really want to focus on here briefly. So on the left hand, we've got this Hanukkiya trophy, which is gifted to the to Wheel Power, who are hosting the 1994 Stoke Mandeville Games by the visiting Israeli team. Now, I'm Jewish, so I saw this and I instantly got very excited because I thought, wow, what a unique thing to find in this sports, medical, etc. collection. And I ended up doing a little blog about it. I wrote a series of blogs during my placement about some of the items that I found in the archive. And I think that was a really nice way to engage with these items and give them some more time for some public research, whilst also not locking it away behind like an academic journal within my PhD thesis. Realistically, people are more likely to read a blog than my PhD thesis. So that was a really nice way to kind of use these objects in a more public setting. And I had a lot of fun going into weird rabbit holes with this item in particular. The other thing I'll mention on this slide is the kind of ceramic bell thing that's on the right hand side. This features the 1998 mascots for the Seoul Games called the Gomodori. And I highlight this just because we're working on a heritage trail app at the minute. So this will be like a interactive thing. You can walk around Stoke Mandeville Stadium and learn about some of the history. And on the Stock About Mascots, I added in this image because I thought, often when we think of mascots, we think of the suits or the big cuddly toys or things like badges and posters, but this kind of shows like some of the weird and wonderful things that you can find in these archives sometimes, things that people have just kept over the years. I believe there's also some commemorative spoons as well for 88. So yeah, just kind of showcase how weird and wonderful some of these things are. But to kind of address some of the things in the title of the presentation, the need to properly organize and archive this collection does kind of highlight some of the invisibility that kind of plagues these collections currently. There are a large amount of amazing resources, but we just need to get to the point where we can use them properly. And so when I was during COVID, for example, I knew that all these items were here. I just couldn't access them to properly look at them and research them. And I think on the grounds of accessibility, particularly what Alistair was speaking about in the introduction, there is a need to make sure that these things are accessible for people, not just physically, although that is a valid concern as well, but also digitally. I know researchers internationally that would love to see things like the cord, but it's just not currently, it's just not available. And I think there are opportunities to enhance accessibility via digitization which can be focuses going forward. It's just obviously there's, as I'm sure you're aware, there are limits on resources and time and everything else when it comes to archives. I'll also mention that the Trust has another ongoing project. I think that's like the 4th ongoing project I've mentioned. This is a 3D scanning project where the idea is some objects will be scanned to make a digital versions, which can then be held in like a virtual exhibition. And again, this is a really exciting way to kind of bring objects to people in new ways that may not be that may be more accessible. And hopefully in the future, that could also apply to bigger items like, say, wheelchairs themselves. There'd be a nice way to show those items and how they evolved. I kind of timed this badly, so I'll just quickly go over a couple of things. So in terms of creating collections, another thing that I would like to focus on is oral history really briefly. The MPHT has an ongoing oral history project, and oral histories generally are very important for disability history in terms of kind of bringing that visibility to people's experiences. And I conducted some oral histories based on my research, where I specifically focused on wheelchair technology. And I think that was a nice way to kind of create this like sub collection of really focused oral histories in a wider general oral history collection about Paralympics, about the Paralympics. So yeah, and then the other thing I'll just mention briefly is one thing that's been really useful in my research has been the Facebook groups. There are Facebook groups of athletes who share like stories and images from games, and that's a really nice way for kind of this grassroots creation of material to come together, and that it presents some interesting opportunities for co-curation and maybe more public kind of archiving projects. But yeah, I've gone over a bit, so I'll just conclude really quickly. To just say, I think there are some really wonderful and varied items in these collections that can be used in various ways within disability history and in wider histories. And I hope this has kind of given you a very, messy but broad insight into what's in there. And hopefully that was interesting for you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was absolutely fascinating. See, thank you everyone who's been asking questions in the chat as well. Like I said, we'll get round to answering those once this session has come to a close. So up next we have Dr. George Gosling, Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Wolverhampton. And I'll just pass you over to George then.
Thank you. Sorry, taking a little bit of time to find how to unmute myself while sharing screens, the complicated things we do. First off, to say thank you to Alistair for inviting me to this, already a fascinating workshop, so I'm very happy to be taking part in it. What I would like to do before I get started any further, I guess I should follow Sam's lead and say, for those of you who can't see me, I am a cisgendered white man with a beard, which statistically is not surprising given that I'm an academic historian. That is the case very, very often. What I would like to do over the next 15 minutes is to kind of talk through what I would say are the sort of 5 stages of a kind of useful relationship between a researcher like me and a particular archive, a particular collection. In this case, a disability collection. And the one in particular I am talking about is the archival collection of a charity called Blind Veterans UK, which for most of its history was known as St Dunstan's. And before I go any further, before I forget, I should also say thank you to Rob Baker, who is the main archivist for Blind Veterans UK, and the organisation for providing me with and giving me permission to use a lot of images that I'm going to use today. These are, yeah, I think you all agree that they add something to be able to see what I'm talking about, if you can. So what I wanted to do was to talk through these 5 stages of this useful relationship. So what are they? Well, the first of them, I would say, is the coming together of the archive, the collection, and the researcher. So for that to happen, of course, the archive needs to exist. And that is I probably don't need to say with the crowd we have assembled here today, that is no small thing. That is in itself a huge achievement, particularly for voluntary sector organisations that often don't have access to the expertise, the resources, the funding to make that happen, or to make that easy, certainly. Sometimes you do get these wonderful moments where you can do things like get funding from the Wellcome Trust, and you can have materials that have been collected and looked after well within an organisation can then be deposited so that they can be catalogued and made accessible. In other cases, you have what we have in the case of Blind Veterans UK, where they have an in-house collection, which is, in this case, a wonderful mix of objects, of documents, you know, like reports, like committee minutes, like newsletters, including the one that has the picture you can see on the screen at the moment. And all kinds of things, including a lot of photographs that I'll be using as well. And these in that organisation are kept in-house, and the people that are using them within the organisation, where that falls, sits alongside things like marketing. So it's important that they are there for a reason, but also important to recognise that the reason they exist and have been kept, there's a different agenda at play there than there is for me as a researcher coming in. But we have to come together anyway. It's the bit where, if this was a romantic comedy, it's where the fates would conspire to bring us together so that our eyes could meet across a crowded room. And in my case, the version of that happened was simply me saying on social media that I was getting a sabbatical from my teaching to do the archival research for my next book, which I'm planning to be a history of charity shops. And the fact that charities running shops has a much longer and more varied history than we often realise. And that's where Rob Baker from Blind Veterans UK got in touch with me to say, this may not be of interest to you, but this charity, Blind Veterans UK, actually for most of its history did run a shop, and for most of the time that was actually this rather grand shop on Regent Street that you can see here, and he was so he was able to bring this to me, that he as the archivist knew about this. The knowledge was already there. The materials were already there. He knew where to find this wonderful image, this photograph of the shop. He knew where to find the write-up and the report of Mr. Selfridge himself being the guest of honour at the grand opening in 1922. He already knew about the shop and the fact that it was there until the 1960s, and that it was replaced with a kind of mail order operation for another couple of decades after. So there's a lot that was already known, but I would say the second part of the five-step kind of relationship is then where the researcher can bring something new in terms of making sense of what's there, bringing a different set of eyes to it. So before I quickly say what I did, what sense I made of it, I should also say that, of course, there's a lot there that will already be known. And for me, some of that information would be new. And I'm assuming it's probably new to you. Like, what is this charity? What is it we're talking about here? So I should briefly say something about it and about these two men. So the two people you can see pictures of here are the founder and the longtime chairman of St Dunstan's, as it was called. Arthur Pearson, Sir Arthur Pearson, is the person you can see on the left. He was the founder of St Dunstan's, also before that the founder of the Daily Express. And when he lost his eyesight to glaucoma, he stepped back from working in the press and started doing things like publishing Braille dictionaries. He was then also the president of the RNIB, the Royal National Institute for the Blind, by the time the First World War broke out. And he decided that he needed to be doing something in particular for people who were being blinded out in the war. And we often think of people perhaps being disabled through serving in the First World War with things like missing limbs. But actually, when you think about the type of warfare, trench warfare, you think about what parts of the body were exposed to things like bullets and shrapnel, facial injuries and associated blindness was actually the most common type of injury. So what he did was quite quickly, fairly early on in the early stages of the war, set up a scheme, a new organisation, which would offer sort of residential rehab and care and perhaps retraining for people who had been blinded in the war. Now, one of those was the person you see on the right, and this is Ian Fraser, who about 5 weeks before his 19th birthday was blinded at the Somme. And he came into contact with St Dunstan's initially actually as a service user, but quite quickly got brought into the running of the organisation. And in 1917 was charged with heading up the aftercare side of their work, which initially seemed like quite a small thing, but as they realised that what they wanted to do was to provide support, ongoing, actually lifelong support for those who had come through St Dunstan's, and I should say the name came from St Dunstan's Lodge, Regent's Park, which was the initial, early on for quite a while, where the residential home was. What they wanted was that the St Dunstaners, as they called them, after they'd left St Dunstan's Lodge, they wanted to provide that ongoing support. And that grew to become an enormous and huge job. So he was taking all of that on. He was actually, although very young, just 24, was the obvious person to take over as chairman of the organisation when in 1921 Pearson died unexpectedly. And Ian Fraser was then the chairman of this organisation, along with lots of other roles, including being a Tory MP and one of the governors of the BBC. For the next 52 years, he was the head of this organisation. And during that time, they were active in a lot of areas. So the residential rehab and training they offered moved out to what became specialist built facilities like this one in Ovingdean near Brighton. They were very involved in developing assistive technologies, like what you can see here. So that might be developing Braille typewriters. It might be the Talking Books Library they set up with the RNIB in the 1930s. Or what you might recognize on the left, you can see here, the kind of famous and familiar long cane, which they developed with the RNIB and US partners in the 1960s. But a part of this that was of particular interest to me is the side of it that links through to the shop and the shops. And that's the things that WBB produced. So as well as having sort of doing rehab work, they would be doing workshop training to give these men new skills. So that might be training them up to be for mat making and basket making, making and repairing boots, or carpentry and joinery. And these were the items that were made there would then be sold in the London shop. And it's a wonderful part of the collection that they have so many of these objects that you can look at and see the quality of them. What I was able to bring to this then was a sense not only of how it operated, what they were trying to do, how much they felt they'd achieved, but I'm also able to come at this from the perspective of a charity historian and to ask kind of how the charity aspect of this is all working. And for me here then to see how the items are understood and how they are advertised. What are the messages coming out here? So the idea that that by buying something from the St Dunstan's shop, you are returning the favour. You know, one good deed, giving up your sight in service for country, for king and empire, then that one good turn deserves another. In this case, supporting those blinded veterans how they are back home. So how this fits into that kind of charity, kind of social dynamic is an important part of what I wanted to do there. But there's then a third part which we can do, which is then to move on from making sense of what we already know to ask, what is it we didn't know? And maybe in a very lucky position where you, for example, have a discrete collection that's been well preserved and perhaps is being passed on to a new archivist who can go through it. And maybe you'll be able to go through everything. But a large collection or one that's been, kind of in one place for a long time, often there is plenty in there that we just don't know, that it takes time to go through and find things. And what I found, that wasn't already known was that this shop was not a one-off. It was actually one of, well, in some respects, actually, it was one shop that was quite like this. But St Dunstan's was training people up not only to produce items for sale in this shop, but also to leave the residential care and to go actually and set up their own shops. And actually what was intended to be far more central to the work of St Dunstan's was not making items for sale in this one shop, but was this, for people to go and set up a whole variety of different kinds of shops. And the important thing here, the idea was that they would not only be setting themselves up with skills, with the ability to make a living, with a home, because you'd have a home above the shop, but was also to do with then embedding them within the community. The idea there was that they would, whilst leaving the very immediate institutional community and support network of St Dunstan's, they would then be able to go and establish new networks of community care and support through the people who they would meet as customers, through the neighbours that they would have. This alongside continued support from the charity. So they would have usually monthly visits from two people, a social visitor to make sure they were set up and coping all right, and a technical visitor to help them with the kind of business side of keeping things running and being successful. So actually we didn't know about this. We didn't know that there were all of these shops around the country, and we found that there were sort of at most more than 100 certainly shopkeepers around the country in the middle of the 20th century who were being set up this way. From the middle of the 1940s, so after the Second World War, soon afterwards, St Dunstan's developed a scheme where they would actually purchase the shop on behalf of people. So the charity itself would own the shop, and then the shopkeeper would work there, run the shop, and over a number of years, perhaps be able to buy the shop outright from the profits and the takings there. Now, what this does is this gives us quite a different story. For me, it's a different kind of charity shop. You know, it usually wouldn't say the name St Dunstan's over the door. It would, but it might have a little thing saying "trained by St Dunstan's" underneath the sign announcing the name of the shopkeeper. But this is actually, in some cases, a charity-owned shop, but very different from the Oxfam or Red Cross shop we might have on the high street today. So I just want to say that there's a whole set of stories that we might look at here in terms of the lives of these blind shopkeepers. And this is, I think, where we can go from just finding what we didn't know, but is in the archive, to the boundaries between what the archive does and doesn't tell us. And I will start to say this fairly quickly, just looking at the time. So so there are things that we know there. So we have a little bit of information about how they might have developed the businesses they were running. Perhaps, for example, branching out from running, being a picture framer into selling art supplies. And this is where we might be going beyond the kind of original idea of selling the work of his hands, as it's described here, to actually working in retail and shopkeeping in a wider set of ways, where the shops we might be looking at would be, it's not just what is produced by himself, perhaps in his own home, but could be all kinds of things. We could be talking about tobacconists, newsagents, and confectioners. And there's a whole part of this here where we can find out a certain amount, but there's also then the fourth part, recognizing what the gaps are that we don't know. And very often in an archive, a disability archive, and a charity archive in particular, it's the actual lived experiences of those who are on the receiving end that we often don't know. The recipient perspective is usually what is the hardest thing to find in a charity archive. So there's still a lot of work I want to do to go through and find out these stories. So that's where we can be filling it in, is to understand what it was like to be running these shops, what kind of support you're receiving as I won't go into more details now, but the kind of assistive technologies that were being developed to help blind shopkeepers in their business, but also what it might have meant in terms of their families, because the assumption was this was a husband and wife partnership. So actually, where are the wives of these blind shopkeepers in this archival collection is a really hard thing to find. But doing all of that, we can then get to the fifth thing, which I'll finally leave it with, which is to then come back to all this and understand what is it that we have found out that's new and what does this mean? Because what it means for a researcher like me trying to understand this as part of a wider history is quite different from what it will mean to the families of those St. Dunstaners who are still very much part of the community. And the charity itself there has a connection to people where this is their own family history, which is something which is there to be explored. So I will leave it there, and yeah, and happy to pick up any of those points in questions if anyone has anything more to say. But thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, George. That was excellent. We'll move on very swiftly to our next speaker. So next up, we have Alex Cowan, who's a project archivist and collection lead for the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive. So over to you, Alex.
Hi there, everybody. I apologise if my voice fades out or fades in a little. It's nearly medication time. I'm just going to start by saying that I too am a cisgendered white man, but I have no beard. I'm wearing black, and there's a dog lying along my feet. I'd like to talk to you about a project that I was an archive project I was instrumental in setting up, which is the rather clumsily monikered NDACA, the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive. And there's some sort of fundamental differences between. Can you see the, okay.
Yes, we can see your slides, Alex.
Yeah, I just the toolboard is over my Right. Okay. There we go. So if I mumble, I can repeat. So here we go. Basically, NDACA is a non-charity focused convention. It focuses on art and design, because it was felt that, namely, the art and design produced by the disability arts movement in the UK. This is felt to be important because art and design reflects, directs and comments on social and political attitudes, changes and upheaval. It formulates a response to those changes through lived individual and collective experience. By examining the way artistic movements have addressed previous crises or issues, can offer solutions to current problems. And also, as I was developing the collection, I began to realise that the ever thorny issue of access, whether it be the access of disabled audiences or non-disabled audiences to collections, has many meanings and pathways, one of which used up quite a lot of my time when I started working on this project. So what is NDACA? Well, the blurb is that it's the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive, a heritage lottery funded project that brings to life the heritage and rich history of the UK-based disability arts movement, which in worldwide disability history, as far as I can tell, is a relatively unique phenomenon, because it involved a group of artists and creators who consolidated to form a movement or a school, if you like, rather than individual artists working by themselves. Began in the late 70s and continues today, and NDACA is primarily the story of disabled people and their allies who broke barriers, helped change the law, starting with the Disability Discrimination Act of '95, and made great culture and art along that journey that commented on the changes they were seeking and the changes they saw. And that's quite an interesting backstory. It was conceived by a disabled artist called Tony Heaton, who was at the time the CEO of the Holden Art Centre in the early 2000s, as a way of preserving and publicising the rich heritage of the UK's disability arts movement. It had a 10-year gestation period, which beginning life at Holden with a key conference on what is disability art. And at that event, Tony Heaton authored a document submitted entitled "What is Ndaka?" This document already spelled out what Heaton felt Ndaka is: a public collection of artworks that celebrates disability arts, and an archive to hold important information relating to disability arts. In the way of these sorts of projects, it had a long gestation period. That key document and conference stated that the term disability arts refers to art that is informed by the personal and/or collective experience of the disabled self. That is, creative work across all art forms and media that has at its core the influence upon the artist of and responses to a disabling role. The project was formally launched in 2018 after funding was secured in 2014. And as a nominal, in terms of the lottery funding, life of 15 years. But obviously we are currently securing funding to keep it running longer than that. I just wanted to start with a couple of interesting representative artworks to give you an idea of the breadth of the collection. On your left is a poster for Disability Cabaret, sponsored by the National Disability Arts Forum in the 1990s. And this was a show that went on to Edinburgh, but it was intended to tour, indicated by the blank bar at the bottom, into which you can add your venue details. And over on the right, we have an interesting collaboration between a non-disabled artist and a disabled comedian. We thought they'd create a superhero, Supergrit, who's able to change his impairment depending on the situation he finds himself involved in. And one of the most interesting things I find about being part of this collection is it has appeal beyond academia, beyond the general public, beyond disabled audiences. The item on the right, the comic book cover, as you'd expect, has resonance for teenage audiences, teenage and early 20s, of all backgrounds. And this is currently one of the most popular and most viewed items on the website. Ndaka, we're lucky enough to have a physical space in the library at Buckinghamshire University in a small repository, about the same size as Sam's Paralympic archive, and an online catalogue and website. The catalogue details and describes around 3,000 deposits made by disabled artists, activists and thinkers. It includes around 3,500 high-resolution digital images of these deposits. It's available for Creative Commons for personal use and study. Fully accessible Ndaka website holds the catalogue and other resources. 30+ oral film histories, profiles of artists and important campaigns and themes, learning resources and timeline chronologies. There's the address down at the bottom. And I should also add that it's an active archive. One of the things we were very keen to avoid was the idea that there was a golden moment in disability arts, in the same way that some people talk about the golden moment of the 1960s in UK culture, which can never be surpassed, bettered, improved on, developed. So Ndaka is very much an open collection, and we're still acquiring current artwork. Partly by choice and partly as a requirement for HDF funding. Ndaka focuses on stories and the objects and work that illustrate these individual journeys. And one of the things we found sells the archive to all audiences is the idea that the audiences relate much better to individual rather than collective experience. If the person tells the story of how they came to terms with the modern world, getting on in life, how they've lived their life alongside their disability, as much more resonant than something that talks about collective experiences. More about I, he, her, him, and they in the individual term, rather than seeing disabled people as the disabled. Depositors were both sought out and approached for the project. Materials and for deposit were selected in close collaboration with depositors. And basically, when we identified artists that wished to participate, or those artists that approached us when they found out about the project, involved a series of interviews where we go and ask them to explain their relationship to the disability arts movement, their experience, their participation of it, and just to keep the collection manageable, to try to select the top 20 or 30 or 40 items that they felt best illustrated their story, their narrative, their journey, which led to some very interesting conversations. And also leads me to the first thing I realized about access. Access is not about just access to a physical or digital space. Access is also a part of the ability to write your own story, to decide on your own narrative, and to shape that narrative alongside the people who catalogue deposits you may make, and the people who are running an archival project, people who are running a museum or collection. The catalogue descriptions and much of the descriptive vocabulary were similarly sourced by interview tagging and folksonomy exercising. I also realised as we go on that the language used, however well-meaning or well-informed a catalogue is, they're just a catalogue, and unless they have a lived experience of disability, they might not see objects or experiences or events in the same way as somebody who's a disabled person who's lived the same experience sees them. So I was very keen that use of appropriate language, not necessarily even politically correct language or the acceptable language, but the language that people use to describe themselves and their own experiences should be included in the catalogue. And we have a wide variety of users, individuals, both disabled and non-disabled, artists, academic, the media, and other heritage collections who wanted to contribute to exhibitions or museum displays. When we started, the whole collection started by Tony Heaton trying to answer the question, what was disability art? Our working definition, and this is drawn straight from our acquisitions doctrine, is art which was and is made by people with impairments, about barriers that are disabling the world. And DECA will continue to focus the scope and story method of our collecting plans and policy to collect this heritage, which is rich and wide ranging. Disability art is informed by the social model of disability. I have included some detail about what I mean by that, but I'm assuming that to most of you, again, know something about it at all. On the NDECA website, there's a very nice little film which was created by a disabled animator that explains the concept. SHAPE, the parent organisation of NDECA, is a 40-something-year-old charity that run by disabled artists that promotes disability arts and disabled artists' careers. And also, you might also be interested to check out Disability Arts Online, which is an affiliated disability arts review site, which has been reviewing the whole field, the whole gamut of different media and different and different range of disability arts. And this is just one of the many founding document, if you like. It's the 10 Commandments from the original days of Tony Eaton's concept of Ndaka. It's from Halton Lee. And it's his definition of the social model of disability and what disability arts is. This used to be at the entrance to the Halton Lee Gallery when Halton Lee was still run as a disability arts colony. I'm sure you're familiar with the social model, but it has a bearing on the way that we decided to create Ndaka. Developed by disabled disability activists and academics as part of the wave of disability rights activism in the 70s. Activism focused on securing disabled people's rights to access and fully participate in British society. And this bid for freedom challenged traditional definitions of disability in disabled people and the role of the state, residential homes, and power and influence of the charity sector. It has its text, if you like. And this is another item from the collection. The Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, started by various disability thinkers about disability, including a man called Rick Finkelstein, created a document in the 70s called the Fundamental Principles of Disability, which defined and laid the groundwork for the definition of the social model. I've included the precursor of that, the medical model, because I feel it affects the way that charities and charitable archives have collected and created material in the past, and also affects the way that people can access their collections now, because they are primarily the medical model. It's defined by health professionals, charities, and non-disabled experts to the medical model of disability, which states that disability is caused by the individual's health condition. This condition determines what the person can and can't do, and implies that in order for everyone to participate fully in society, they need to be non-disabled. Disability is a result of a person being different rather than lack of social rhythm. And it's inescapable and unfortunate that since the 80s, charity archives have been wrestling with this dichotomy between presenting the disabled experience in the light of the social or medical model. The social model of disability proposes that what makes someone disabled is not the disability, but social attitudes and provision. It's a civil rights approach to disability. British society was set up to be accessible to people with disabilities, and they will not be excluded or restricted. In short, they will not be disabled, and you can put disabled in inverted quotations if you want. Key distinction is made between individual impairments, which may prevent people from doing something, and disability, which is an additional disadvantage bestowed by society, which treats these impairments as abnormal and excuses disabled people for the participation in society. The social model of disability says that it is society which disables impaired people. And there are environmental ways people can be disabled, physical access, attitudinal ways that people can be disabled, organisational. So now that I've done the dry politics bit, what's in Ndaka? All kinds of art made by all kinds of artists, paintings and drawings, cartoons, sculpture, theatre, photography, music and film, digital artworks, live art and poetry. On the left is a work by a sculptor now unfortunately along with us called Alan Reynolds, called Cherub, a piece of artwork he created specifically designed to be designed to be mounted to be as if being viewed by a wheelchair user. On the right is a musician called Ian Stanton. Strong links to GMCODP, who are doing a talk later. Representative collections that show artists' aesthetic development and career path. There's a Tanya Robey portrait of Jane Campbell, who sits in the Lords on the left, which is part of her portrait series, which is disabled activists, movers and shakers. In the centre is a Nancy Willis sculpture. She's one of the first disabled artists to have a residency at a hospital, which is Hammersmith Maternity Unit. And Colin Hambrook's work on the right, called The Hanged Man, which is a commentary on his experiences in the old school mental health system in the UK. Political campaigns and the art that comments on it, whether it be the Disability Discrimination Act, on the left-hand side, Not Dead Yet, which is a current campaign attacking government measures to allow assisted suicide. CAT, which is a campaign for accessible transport. And on the right, with the yellow balloons, Direct Action, Block Telethon, which saw off the ITV telethon in the early 90s, which were charity events which disabled activists felt portrayed disabled people as objects of pity and charity. Themes like representation, access, and sexuality. Some of you may recognise Matt Fraser, who's been active in TV and media since the early 90s. In the middle, a poster by Nancy Willis for the Grey Theatre Company. On the right, another Nancy Willis, one of 4 self-portraits she did of herself and pastels early in her career. We also have political ephemera, clothing, badges, posters, notes and sketches. A Piss on Pity t-shirt is our most requested item for people who wish we made t-shirts, which is from the Block Telethon campaign. In the middle is one of Tony Heaton's sketchbooks for a truly monumental piece of stone sculpture. I'm sorry, I seem to my slides are frozen. I do apologize, my slides are frozen. I'm just going to go back and see if I can. Physical objects outside the digital realm, like many of the other collections we got offered. We started out intending with a collection of 1,500 digital items, soon ballooned to 3,500 digital items. And there's a huge amount of additional material that we're offered, even without an organisational focus. So there's a lot more to be discovered, lots of individual stories to be examined. And this is the Ndaka collections envisaged waiting to be transferred to its home at Buckinghamshire University. And I can assure you it's considerably bigger than that now. I'm sorry, guys, I'm going to have to stop. I've just given up. I do apologise.
That's quite all right, Alex. Got some really good comments and things there. So yes, thank you so much for that talk. That was absolutely fascinating. So we're just about to come up to the break. We've got a little bit of time for some questions. So what I'll do is I'll ask each of you one of the questions that has been asked in the chat, and if you're able to maybe during the break or later, I'd ask the speakers to answer the remaining questions in the chat themselves. So we'll start with Sam. So I'm just going to get everything organized. So yeah, just a few questions for Sam. So I'll just pick one and then you can answer the remaining ones in chat later. So is there any evidence that the change in equipment design over time is influenced by greater involvement of disabled designers / sports persons in the design process, designed with instead of for people?
That is a really great question, and that is actually the basis of my PhD thesis. So as a really, really brief overview, the way that at least I'm understanding wheelchair technology developed in general was generally designed by manufacturers working with medics in, say, the 1900s, before that, 1930s. There were some disabled designers like Everest and Jennings, but generally it was a medical focused product made by the medical establishment for disabled people as patients. They were very heavy and not very usable for independent living. Then after World War II, and with the development of things like wheelchair sport, there became a desire for lighter wheelchairs that were more suitable for kind of other uses, including sport, and wheelchair users started to make adaptations to wheelchairs. And then following this, that goes on into, like, say, the 1980s. And then around that time, we start to get more non-disabled or non-wheelchair using, I should say, engineers getting involved in that process, starting companies. And now where the industry is at is what it's more focused on professional designers, kind of who generally are non-disabled, working with Paralympians or working with like elite athletes to make like custom-made devices. That is a very, very broad overview, but it's a fantastic question because it there's a lot about agency and independence and the economics of all of this that you can draw from that. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thanks very much, Sam. So next question will be for George. George, there's some nice comments in there about the role that St. Dunstan's had in treating eye injuries.
Yeah, some fascinating projects in Chelsea and Surrey coming up in the comments, so thanks for sharing those.
So just the one question, is there an ongoing relationship with the BV UK archive, and are they aiming to build on some of your research?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Melinda. Yeah, so as I was sort of trying to say, I realised I was running a bit over, so I rushed myself at the end. What I wanted to wrap up saying is that I feel like I'm very much in the middle of that process, that working with the archive as the researcher, and I mean, I've slowed down ever since we had this thing called COVID. You may have heard of it. It threw a few things up in the air, but I am hoping to kind of finish this. So I mean, the very first step of that is simply just for me to be writing up what I've already got, which is that first stage of finding out what we didn't know. So knowing about these shopkeepers, knowing that there were 100 plus blind shopkeepers around the country that have been set up, living in this setup with this kind of charitable framework behind them. Just the very existence of them tells us something, and so that's my first thing to do is to write that up and think about ways to share that, and I'll work with Blind Veterans UK and how to share that for different audiences. But the second part of it then is to go further. So like I was saying, is to know what is and isn't there, even in an organisation like St Dunstan's, which is very much about the community and very much about the St Dunstaners themselves being part of it and being empowered. There is, of course, an organisational perspective that is there in most of the written documents. So, if you've got these two different types of visitors going out to see the shopkeepers, then the reports that they're writing, or the records they're keeping, are written from that perspective. So they are the organisational view of the shopkeepers' lives. That's a lot of what's going to be there. But so whether it's about reading against the grain of those documents, like trying to identify the gaps and the silences, or whether it's to do with building around that through things like oral histories, then that's a process there that I would like to do. So I'm hoping to get some funding to bring somebody in to work with me who can spend more time sat in the St Dunstan's archive, pouring through all of the different reports and things. And hopefully the thing there, from working with what we already know and what else we could do, then the kind of the final part of that would be very much something we've talked about, that there being an ongoing relationship to work out what all of this means. And that shouldn't just be me as a historian saying, well, this new evidence, this new material fits into the historical picture this way from an academic history point of view, but also working with the kind of the St Dunstan's community. You know, the last of these types of shopkeepers were there around the end of the 60s. So it's now been quite a long time. Probably don't have any of the shopkeepers to talk to themselves, but they will likely have had children and grandchildren who may well still be in touch through St Dunstan's, where we might be able to talk to them about what perhaps their grandfather who ran a shop and their grandmother who did a lot of the work for running the shop, but probably isn't almost at all in any of the records we can find. There's work we can do there on finding those stories and figuring out what they mean to different people. So yeah, we are hoping to keep that going.
Brilliant, thank you, George. So final question for Alex, just before we go away for a break very quickly. You touched on a lot of different points there that are all really, really interesting, really relevant. So most of the questions were discussing cataloging descriptions and how to tag those. So I'll just pick one of the ones. So can you tell us a little bit more about the issues that might have been raised or changes to traditional script descriptions that led to?
Well, the first thing it made me realise is if you're an older user of the internet, you might be searching under older terminology. So you have to leave in a certain amount of traditional, maybe even prejudicial description or language, because somebody from the older generation might describe themselves as handicapped, which is a redundant, a redundant piece of terminology. It revealed that tagging is a dangerous cause, unless you have a list of pre-selected tags, because people misspell things. It can get very medical if people can write their own tags, because then it gets bogged down in individual types of the details of impairment, which isn't necessarily helpful and turns you back towards a medical focus. Because obviously disability is part of a disabled individual's experience, but it's not the be all and end all. It's part. And the bit I found most interesting was how you generate descriptors or potential tags. And the most success I had was putting things up on Flickr Commons or Instagram and asking people to tag them, either as part of day-long exercises or campaigns over week, which gave me a vocabulary that we could think about including. And it also made me realize that just by the act of writing for audio description, as the speaker's been trying to do today, that imposes not restrictions, but other considerations that come into what language is used, what language is not used. So much so that on the next lottery application we're working on, which is a more general disability history project, we're going to try to create a thesaurus to describe this disability focused projects. Because all the ones that are commercially available or academically available are still medical. And if you go somewhere quite cutting edge, like the Social History Information Committee, or SHIC, SHIC, disability description in there because it's a social history archive with an industrial focus. Disability is still described medically, and it's on a tree for industrial accidents, or not considered to be part of a wider person's experience. I mean, all the way through, the question I asked about people's artwork, and we were talking to people about their selection, was how would you like it to be described, and how would you like yourself to be described? And that was the best starting point. You extrapolate on from that. trouble with catalogue is it's so formal. It has to, by necessity, it's so formalized. Introducing new definitions or new words is a very long process. And there's quite an interesting literature about, particularly to do with taxonomies, about trying to develop user-informed catalogues and using far taxonomies that deal specifically with disability. That I used when I was taking on a catalogue, which I'm honest was too big for my relatively modest skills.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people, I'm sure, can relate to a lot of those issues you've brought up. I know that sort of prejudice language and how that interacts with cataloging is quite a big issue in the LGBT community as well, and their archives. So it's a broader sort of issue than just disability, I think. We are running a little over time, so we'll take a quick, I think, 5-minute break here, and we'll be back just after 20 past, everyone. Thanks. So welcome back, everyone, from the break. So we're now into session 2, talking about accessing disability archives. So our next speaker is Katie Sawyer, who's an access and inclusion worker at the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People with Archives Plus, which I will let her explain what that all means. Take it away, Katie.
Thank you, Alistair. Well, he's already said what my title is and where I'm working, but yes, that's me. I'm Katie Sawyer. And yes, I'm the Access and Inclusion Worker for GMCDP, Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People. So this talk is going to be about accessing our archive. It's mostly going to be about digital access. I know Alex very kindly brought up points about how access is important, physical access, digital access, and all other kinds of access. This is mostly going to be about digital access. Our collection is mostly paper-based, so there is a bias there. Most of what I'm focusing on are digital formats of paper items in our archive. What do I actually do? So all of our employees at GMCDP and all of our members are disabled people. And given that our archive content is about disabled people's history, we think it's really important that disabled people can access that history. So for my role, that means I try and make our archive as accessible as possible with varied formats of each item. So that might be large print, easy read, audio, captions, braille, etc., just depending on what the kind of item is. And just to define what we mean by disabled people, we mean anyone facing disabling societal barriers in relation to their impairments and conditions. So that's physical impairments, mental distress or illness, hearing, visual impairments, learning impairments, neurodivergent people, and those with chronic illnesses. All covered, anyone who defines themselves as disabled. We've also touched on the social model today, but it's worth just defining quickly in case it's something that you're not familiar with. The social model underpins all of our work at GMCDP. And what it means is that a person's condition, characteristic, or feature is their impairment. So I have ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, so that's my impairment. And then the barriers that that person faces due to society, that might be a physical barrier, organizational, attitudinal. Together, that causes a disability. So for instance, there's an image of me at an art gallery, sitting very uncomfortably on those classic wooden benches. And that's a disability, that's a barrier, because it meant that I was not able to rest effectively whilst I was at the art gallery. And the reason the social model is really important is because it puts the onus on society to make changes rather than on the disabled person. Society needs to break down the barriers rather than the disabled person needing to fix themselves to live in the society. At GMCDP, we usually go for universal design or a pan-impairment view. Sometimes you need to think about a person's specific impairment, but universal design usually has a lot of side benefits. So for instance, if you put captions on YouTube videos, that for deaf viewers, that then can improve literacy in children who are watching. So our website here, as you can see, this is our website page for view by accessibility. So that means a person can click to that page and say, I want to see all of the things in your collection that are British Sign Language, captioned, easier to read, etc. Here's a couple of nice things that are in our archive. It's about 130 linear meters and it's only 6% catalogued, so there's a lot of work to do. We have a 3-year project, which is to catalogue as much of the archive as we can, probably not all of it, but as much as we can. Mostly it contains items from GMCDP's history of campaigning and protesting, but it also contains some items from other organisations such as the British Council of Disabled People and the Direct Action Network, UPIS, etc. So here we have just a couple of my favourite items. So I have a postcard from the Independence Festival in 1997, which says, "Not my carer, not my brother, not my friend, he's my lover." That's an item made by a disabled person, a piece of art. Disabled People Bite is my very favourite postcard. So this is a postcard that reads, "Disabled people bite the hand that patronises," with an image of someone petting a dog and then similarly petting a disabled person on the head. And we also have, this is a slightly different item from the Spastic Society, now known as Scope. And this is a collection doll, which some people may remember seeing on the street. It's similar in appearance to a guide dog. Is the same kind of vibe where you put money in the top of the doll. So most of our collection is by disabled people about their own history, but we do have some items that are more from a charity perspective. But that's why our collection is really rare and really unique, is because most of it is disabled people's history from disabled people. Moving on to accessible formats. So this has been a subject of my research for about 6 months, and I had to research what was the best practice for a variety of different kinds of formats. And this has come from all sorts of different places, and I'm hoping to have this finished as guidelines for other people that want to use them, other organisations, hopefully by the end of this year. They're still quite rough at the moment. In my view, these first couple of formats are the kind of essential ones, the ones that you really need to have, because otherwise the item is completely inaccessible. However, that's going to depend on your archive. It's going to depend on your audience. For instance, if you were a deaf archive, you might need to place a greater emphasis on having British Sign Language translations. So for me, these are the really essential ones. The first thing is alt text or image descriptions. So here's a photograph, a black and white photo, a crowd of around 20 people, some wheelchair users, moving in a procession away from the railway station. So that might be what you'd include in the alt text, which is usually shorter and is embedded into the code of the website. And then for an image description, you might go a bit more detailed and say who's in the image. Front and center is Sharon Nace, later Rowan Jade, being pushed in her wheelchair. A placard attached to her wheelchair says Civil Rights Now in block capitals, etc. You might give more detail about what's actually in the image. So the reason why alt text and image descriptions are important is otherwise someone who's using a screen reader, the screen reader will just say image, it can't read it, so that's completely inaccessible. It's also good for people who have poor internet speeds, which is me, I'm cobbling together as much internet as I can today. If the person's internet can't load the image, they'll at least be able to read the alt text and have an idea of what is in the image. It also improves your search engine optimization because the search engine can see what's in the image and hopefully throw up your results higher in the rankings. Accessible PDFs are really important especially for screen reader users. So you need to tag your accessible PDFs. So that means you need to tell the PDF what the type of content is. So is this a heading, an image, text, a list, things like that. And again, that's really important for screen readers. So you can see this is Adobe Acrobat Pro, and those tags down the left-hand side, figure, P means text or paragraph, H1 means a heading, things like that. Captions are also really essential. So open captions are automatically burnt into the video. They show up automatically. And then closed captions are ones where you have to click a button to get the captions to show up. So for this, we have a YouTube video. Claire Lewis, now MX Dennis Queen, covers Johnny Crescendo's classic song, The Ballad of Josie Evans. And you can see we have closed captions, which is that CC button at the bottom of YouTube, and is then captioning the content. So as I said, those are really important for deaf viewers, but they're also great for reducing sensory overload and improving concentration for people who are watching. And then on the right, we have an audio transcript for The Incredible Shrinking Man, which is a song. And again, that's completely essential for deaf users who otherwise wouldn't be able to access the audio. But it also improves your search engine optimization because, again, the search engine can read the transcript and know what is in the audio file. So for me, those are the kind of essentials for our archive, at least. Even better than that is to have even more formats for a variety of different access needs. So we've got a large print item, which is from GMCDP's information bulletin in 2013. So you can see the font is nice and big, nice and clear. We've also got a text-only version of a Coalition magazine. So that's very simply just take all of the text that was from the document and put it in a Word document and take images out, just pure text. And so those are useful for screen reader users who don't want to faff about with the images, because sometimes even with an accessible PDF, they're still a bit of a pain to use. And sometimes it's just easier to have the plain text. And it's a simpler format to focus on. Even better is to also have Braille for Braille users. Easier to read, or you might have heard it be called plain English. So this is where you take your text and remove any jargon, you reduce the text to short sentences, and that's really useful for learning disabled people, but also non-native English speakers, because the content has been made more understandable, made simpler. Even better than easier to read is to have easy read, which is where you take the text and you cut it down even further to what is the most important, the core information that the person needs to know. And then you also attach images that will help the person understand the text, so they kind of work in tandem. And again, that's really useful for learning disabled people and non-native English speakers. British Sign Language is also really good to have. So this is a video from our archive, which is our welcome to our archive video, which has been interpreted by a sign language interpreter. So that's a very quick rundown of a lot of the different formats. As far as actually doing the transcribing, which I've now moved on to, having done all of this research for 6 months, my first step is to let software help you as much as it possibly can. So if you have the budget, it can often make the process a lot easier. So things like Otter AI is an AI that will transcribe audio and video for you. So that will save you from having to manually type out what's in the audio. It will do a rough translation and then you can just correct it. You can get free minutes. I think it's 60 minutes per month or something like that, and then you have to pay a bit more. Adobe Acrobat Pro is really useful for making accessible PDFs, as I said before. So here's another accessible PDF, Coalition magazine, June 2019. However, I would leave plenty of time for you to learn how to use that software, especially Adobe Acrobat Pro. It is not as intuitive as it might be. And also sometimes you don't have the budget for, software. And so you have to come up with cheaper ways to do things. Another tip I would have, which kind of just applies to all types of work, but especially transcription, which can be a little bit monotonous, is to vary the types of transcription that you're doing. So I tried to do accessible PDFs all week and it just felt like my brain was falling out of my head. I then have learned to mix it up, do image descriptions, audio files, things like that. Sometimes, however, you can get into sort of a flow state like you can if you're crafting or cooking or doing something creative. You can sometimes get in the flow and just keep going, but it's better to mix it up and have lots of breaks and stretching, get up and move around. And also, if you're someone who can work with music or audio whilst you're concentrating on something else, it's really nice to listen to podcasts and music in the background. As I said, it can get a little bit monotonous sometimes. Tip number 3 is probably the most important one, which is to ask your audience what they want. And especially you must ask disabled people what they want if you're working with disability collections, because there is no point digitizing meeting minutes from 1983 if people actually want to access photographs from protest marches. You need to ask them what content they want and what kind of access needs they have and how you can fulfill that. So currently we're asking for feedback from our staff, our executive council and our steering group, who are all disabled people. And then we'll be asking for more feedback once I've completed more transcription from our GMCDP members, who are also disabled people. However, saying that, disabled people are not all going to have the same opinion. They're not a monolith. There are going to be disagreements. There are going to be different access needs. Sometimes there might be access needs that contradict each other. There's not one right way of doing transcription for disability collections. There's going to be lots of different ways, and you're going to have to consult and ask and find out. And of course, I had to throw in just a quick Pirates of the Caribbean meme. So this is Captain Barbosa and Elizabeth Swann with the classic quote, "The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules." And that really covers how I feel about my guidelines that I've been writing, is they are just guidelines. They're not one way to do things. The final tip, I think I've mostly managed to run to time, is to just start somewhere. It can get really overwhelming. You think you have to do everything all at once, and oh my God, my entire collection is not accessible. I've got to do everything all at once. But just start somewhere. If you can start somewhere that's easy and start somewhere that you know that people want to access, then that's all for the good. I always recommend captions as a really easy transcription method to start with, because a lot of collections, a lot of archives, museums have YouTube videos, which often don't have captions on. So if you can put captions on them, you're, as I said, improving access for deaf viewers, for children with learning, children to improve their literacy, learning disabled people, non-native English speakers. It's that universal design. It's going to benefit lots of people just by doing one thing. And to help you learn how to do captions, I would really recommend StageTech's free online training. It's called Digital Access Training on YouTube. It's a series of, I think, 6 videos, really comprehensive, and it's free. And it just walks you through the whole process and why access is important, why caption access especially is important. I'm just going to finish on this quote that I've absolutely stolen from an archivist at Central Library, who said about our collection that it's not important that we catalogue every single item by the end of the 3 years, because we won't, because it's too many things. It's more important that our collection is useful. And so that's really where I'm coming from with my work, is making sure that people can access what they want to view, rather than it being stuck in a catalogue and being beautifully catalogued but inaccessible to them. And my email, if anybody would like to contact me, is katie@gmcdp.com, and our website is disabledpeoplesarchive.com if you want to have a look at what we've been doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie. That's so interesting. Some really good resources there as well for people who want to do that kind of work themselves. As you say, it's never an end point. It's always an ongoing process. So I think everyone would be in agreement with you there. So our final talk for the day is Dr. Grayson Brillmeyer. This session will not be recorded, so we'll be picking up the recording again after the following break. So I'll just stop the recording there.
And thanks, Alistair. I'd just like to say thank you before we start to the speakers that we've had so far, because they've been such important and interesting and useful papers. And I know that I'll be going away and thinking about a lot of the issues that they've raised. So thank you to everyone who's taken part. I think the idea of the next session is just to give us all a chance to reflect on what we've heard, and maybe to explore a little bit more deeply some of the points that have been raised. It's going to be a discussion. We've called it a panel discussion, but really it's more of a conversation. It's a chance for you to get involved as well. So if you want to carry on the conversation in the chat, just feel free, because I think some of the comments that have been coming up have been really useful as well. So I'm going to lead this session, and we've got 3 people who are taking part, as well as all of you. So the 3 people, if you could put your cameras on, please. So you know this one. This is Alistair. And we have Ian, and is Angie here? Have you seen her, Alistair, on the participants?
Yes, she's in the participants. I don't know if she's able to come back.
Yeah, I'm here. I just can't start my camera.
That's fine. Don't worry, Angie. Do you think you can't start it at all, or are you trying?
It just says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, hold on then. 2 seconds.
Thanks, Alfred.
Right, that might have.
There you go.
Here.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. Okay, so I've just got some questions, general questions to ask you, but I hope the conversation will just flow. So if we can start by, you're just going to sort of introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about why you're interested in this particular area. So Alistair, if we set off with you.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just reintroduce myself then. I'm Alistair Batchell. I'm a project archivist at the University of Dundee Archive Services, and I am currently cataloguing the collection of the Brittle Bones Society.
Thank you. And Ian?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Ian Hutchison. I'm a research affiliate in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow. I'm a historian of disability. I look at all aspects of impairment and disability, and I'm very much interested in personal experience of impairment and also family members and the wider family network in some of these stories.
Great, thanks Ian. And finally, Angie?
Yeah, so I'm Angie, and I have been a member of the Brittle Bones Society pretty much all my life. So I've been involved in kind of doing some of the interviews and preparing some of the photographs and things like that for the History Bones, which Alistair worked on.
Great, thank you. So we've got a kind of archivist, and we've got a historian, and we've got somebody who's involved in the charity with lived experience. So it would be really good to get your different perspectives on this. So I thought I'd ask a really basic question to start with, which is why you think it's important to preserve disabled heritage. So Alistair, from your point of view of an archivist and working on this collection, you could just sum up why you think it's important that we've preserved the archives.
So archives tend to preserve certain narratives based on who's created them, and in this, the example of the Brittle Bones Society, it's a charity collection, and which basically functions as a business collection, but it's also telling that story from the perspective of people with lived experience of osteogenesis imperfecta. So for me, it's important for that particular kind of collection to be preserved because you don't find that kind of narrative anywhere else. And it's important to get those particular voices and make those available to people. And it's important for people today who have the condition to be able to look back at those records and say, oh, I recognize that person. I know sort of, I can relate to those experiences that are being described, and also to appreciate how things have changed over the years.
Okay, thank you. So with you, Ian, as a historian, obviously you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective. You're not trying to kind of create this material, or but you're using it in research. So can you say a little bit about what you?
I'm trying to find what people have already created. Yeah. I work mainly on the 19th century into the early 20th century. So I'm looking at the period when various disabling conditions were in the grasp of benevolent societies, benevolent people, the upper classes. And when I first started looking at various sources, a lot of the records from Victorian times tend to be institutional records. Their annual reports, their minute books. And I got really so frustrated quite early on that I was not hearing the voices of people who identified as disabled. And when I finally had one or two instances where I managed to crack that, I also became aware that this kind of institutional model, if people came under the control of an institution, people who identified as disabled, the chances are they were only within that institution's grasp for a short time of their lives. So there was a bigger story surrounding people like that. And there were also people who live with some type of impairing condition that were never ever under the gaze of an institution or of the poor law or some of these other things. So there was a much bigger story out there, and that's what's been my kind of mission, to try and uncover some of these experiences in Victorian and Edwardian times.
Yeah, so it's about people, really.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And Angie, I'm really interested to hear from your perspective, because had you thought about the idea of an archive before the history project that you were involved with? And what do you think about archives?
Probably not so much as an archive and having the sort of recognition of what that was and what it would do. We knew that we had a huge amount of paper and a huge amount of boxes just full of stuff that we needed to sort through, but we were very mindful that we didn't want to lose any of that. And, you know, there's a bit of a, for me, having grown up with the Brittle Bone Society, you know, it's more than an organisation, it's more than a charity that maybe helped me out with wheelchair batteries every now and again. You know, it's part of my family, it's my community, and it's a bit like looking through the family photo album. You know, it's a bit like that. It's as nostalgic as that. So we didn't want to lose that. So, you know, I think having it in a nice kind of a package, the project put it into, was amazing for us personally, but then also we can share that with other people and future generations as well, because I think it's really important that they know where the Brittle Bone Society came from, but it did start with a couple of families in Dundee who really wanted to make a difference, and that's what they did. And the Brittle Bone Society, touch wood, now is sustainable for the future, but it looks very different now than it did 50 years ago. So it's great that people can see that.
Mm-hmm. And I don't suppose you have any sense of whether or not the archive can be used as a kind of campaigning tool in terms of getting more support or resource?
I think it very much can. I think it probably already has, because, you know, it does catch the attention of people walking by, people who haven't heard of the condition, people who haven't ever thought about the advances in technology and, you know, kind of how people live their lives independently. Have kind of seen it, you know, in public spaces and thought, oh, what's this about? You know, so they can see how we've progressed and how things have moved on. And therefore, you know, I'm sure that within a campaigning, you know, kind of arena could be really, really useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. I think a lot of the discussion today has been about acknowledging the importance of preserving disabled heritage, but equally trying to kind of unpick some of the issues and the difficulties and the problems involved with it. So we've heard about, for example, myself, Alistair, not having necessarily the vocabulary to be able to talk about the Brittle Bone Society archive correctly, or not really understanding how to approach cataloguing of it. And Grayson particularly brought up some issues about non-representation or misrepresentation or problematic representation. And I was particularly struck about the idea that there is an issue with looking at archives that misrepresent, but the fact that that has meaning in itself. So we should acknowledge that and not necessarily try to sort of hide that, but acknowledge the inaccuracies that are there, because that's part of the historical record. So those were just some of the kind of difficulties that I picked up on. I don't know, Alistair, from your perspective and listening to the previous papers, whether there was anything that particularly struck you.
In terms of the Brittle Bone archive itself, certainly I think the thing that struck me most about, well, Grayson's talk was that emotional impact. There's quite a lot of material in the Brittle Bones archive that is purely administrative, and that while it tells that story, doesn't sort of strike the emotions as such. But there is some material in there which I think it's very, very impactful. In terms of sort of difficulty of language and things like that, and how to actually parse that and create a vocabulary, I don't think it has necessarily the same kind of difficulties that a collection that maybe Ian might have worked with in terms of language, because in a lot of ways that transition from older terminology had already happened. And we were in the phase of the sort of 60s and 70s where the disability rights movement was really picking up. So in that respect, there's not a lot, there's a little, but there's not a lot of difficult language that needs to be kind of parsed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you don't think that there are sort of issues then around moving beyond language, but around sort of representing people? How can you sort of square with yourself the fact that you're trying to represent a condition that you don't have?
That's a really good question. Yes, I mean, yes, I don't have the condition, but I think the important part of what this project is about is that we are collaborating with the society. So I've got to meet people with the condition, work with people with the condition, find out more about what it is, more about what it actually is and how it affects people. And getting that experience is really important for then how I go about cataloging and describing the material itself, which isn't something that you would have if you were cataloging an older collection or a collection of an organization that no longer exists. I mean, George was talking about the fact that, you know, the oral histories are really important, but unfortunately no longer be able to speak with the original owners of the shops. So I think in a way it's quite lucky that I'm able to do that. And it really highlights that sooner rather than later is much better in terms of archiving this history.
Yes, maybe Angie, I can come on to you, because I think one of the things that we're struggling with from our professional perspective, and perhaps even Ian from a historian's perspective, is that we're trying to, you were talking about Brittlebone Society being your family.
Yeah.
We're basically sort of taking it away, and we're putting it in a university, and we're doing sort of professional things to it. And we do things like try to decide what to keep and what not to keep, and how to describe the material.
Yeah.
And there can be a lot of kind of problems and danger in that, in that we haven't lived through this with you,
Yeah.
and it's not part of our memory or
Yeah.
our identity. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, or you had any tips for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think really it's probably all dependent on the quality of the conversation. So if you, I guess part of your role is to ask the people who have got the lived experience, who have, you know, the obviously for the Brittlebone Society, you know, we've followed it along through all these years and it is part of our family. If you've asked us the right questions, then our answers will hopefully give you a real feel for the culture of the organisation, what it has meant for families, what it has meant for individuals, and how we've progressed over the years. And I think, you know, I think Alistair, you know, I think you've nailed it. I think it's great, you know, that what we've got at the moment is fantastic, and that's almost part of the test that Alistair, who didn't have any knowledge of the condition of the organisation, has been able to get such a good understanding and archive it in such a way that makes sense for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. And yeah, I think having those conversations, but making sure we continue to have those conversations going forwards. So it's more like a partnership. So we're providing a home, but the material still belongs, sort of in every moral sense, to you, because it's your history, as you said.
I think one thing, it feels to me that this hasn't been rushed. You know, it's taken a little while to do, and it's you know, speaking to lots of different people who are going to have lots of different memories and lots of different evidence. And you know, when you've not been too sure, you've come back to us and had another conversation, and it's kept going until you've got it right. And yeah, there's not much more that you can do with than that, I guess.
That's very diplomatic of you to say it hasn't been rushed, because I know we've had it for ages. Yes, I think you're right. It is a two-way thing.
I don't think it can be rushed. I don't think it should be rushed.
Yeah.
I think keeping going backwards and forwards for that conversation is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. And then Ian, coming at it from your perspective, which again is slightly different, because a lot of the people that you're looking at are dead and in the past. So how do you kind of square that difficulty of trying to talk about people who are dead and you don't have the same condition or experience as them?
Well, you can do that with a certain aura of safety around you, certainly. I mean, on the subject of language, language evolves all the time, and some of the terms of different conditions in the past that are now considered offensive and pejorative, it did actually start off as a kind of scientific terminology to define things, and then they got corrupted. And that language has continued to evolve. And I rather suspect that some of the terms which are now current, which we think are fair and will not cause offence, I'll be interested to see, well, I won't be here, but in 20 or 30 years' time, if some of those terms are challenged and are replaced. On the main thrust of your question, Caroline, I think looking at contemporary stuff, interviewing and so forth, and I do a lot of oral testimony, oral history, it offers a lot of opportunities, because you can look at institutional records and they tell you certain things. You speak to people and they'll say, now this is what really happened, so you can get that inside view. But you do proceed then with a bit of trepidation when you start to write this stuff up, because you do worry about saying something which someone will take issue with and think you're misrepresenting their views and so forth. I don't think it happens a lot, but there's always that element of risk there. I don't know if Angie's got views on this. Angie, you looked on the development of the archive over 60 years as being a very progressive journey, but do you get dissenters and different views within the brittle bone community that so that you're aware of kind of debates and differences of perspective?
Yeah, probably not necessarily on an official basis, but certainly, when we all get together, especially social media as well, helps us to have these debates. And, you do find out that even people that have very similar lived experiences have very different opinions. Mm-hmm. And I think, a lot of that depends on age and where in the country they are and their experience of living with OI, which is osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bones. So yeah, there certainly are differences of opinion and difference in recollection of how people remember things and their sort of understanding of why things have changed the way they are. Mm-hmm. Capturing that will be really hard.
Yeah, it's and that's something that we need to remember is obviously, if you look at the past, there's no truth, there's whatever, because different people have different perspectives and different memories of it. And it is exactly that, Angie, it's about capturing it. So I suppose if I was to ask you one final thing is what do you think, if we start with you, Alistair, what do you think that we could do better from the perspective of an archivist to capture a better disability heritage or disability history?
It's quite a big question, because I think
I know you've only got like 4 minutes left.
Yeah, and not to sound very pessimistic, but I think there is quite a lot that archivists could do to make things better in terms of preserving disabled heritage, and part of that is that collaborative element. And there's lots of ongoing conversations about, as we've touched on today, cataloging terminology and all that kind of thing. But I think one of the sort of thrusting things about this whole seminar was that disability heritage is often quite invisible purely because it's not couched in those terms. We don't describe certain conditions as being disability collections because that isn't how they've been mainly described. So I think possibly opening up that description to other collections, older collections, and see them through that lens might be really helpful. I don't know how the others feel about that.
Yeah, Ali has just put something in the chat about exactly that. And I think Alex was alluding to that as well, about the label disabled. And yeah, it's not a black and white thing. And yeah, we shouldn't forget that there are lots of things that are invisible that aren't necessarily labeled that. So that's a really good point to have made, Alistair. Ian, in terms of you as a historian, what do you think you could do better?
I mean, disability is a collective term, and it's actually one of fairly recent origin. So, you know, if you go into an archive catalogue and put in disability as a keyword, the chances are, if you get it at all, you'll miss an awful lot of stuff, because if it's even catalogued under a disabling condition, it won't be under that collective term. So, you know, the way collections are organized and keywords are allocated is perhaps one area. And also, I've found, looking at different archives, you can get information on lived experience of different impairments in all sorts of odd places. And if you've got an archivist who has been in place for many a long year that knows their collection, they're worth their weight in gold for saying, oh, look at these estate papers. There was a gamekeeper, blah, 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 and you get a story. You would never have found that in the catalogue because it's in a totally different section of the archive, and it's the archivist that knows their collection that can point you in that direction. Places new archivists coming in just a year or two, a bit of a disadvantage, because it's the accumulation of that knowledge about the collection over time.
Thank you, Ian, for reminding us all how important we are as archivists. I
just also add something else, that, you know, disability is actually mainstream in my view. It's mainstream. Unless we go out with a big bang, we will all be disabled at some time in our lives. So it's not a minority thing at all. But even if you just walk through your local shopping centre and look around you at the number of shoppers that you know are using an aid to navigate their way about, who are wearing one of the sunflower lanyards. It's actually everywhere. It's not just a little minority sport, as it were, and I think we should all be aware of that. It's part of everyday life.
Yeah, thank you. And so perhaps we can finish with you, Angie. If there's thinking about preserving the history of disabled people, what do you think we could all do better?
And that's quite a difficult question for me to answer.
I know, I'm sorry.
The main thing that's coming to mind at the moment is just, you know, the fact that we're now in 2022, the way that we gather information, you know, it's all online, and even through the pandemic, we've seen a huge difference between actually being face to face and doing everything via Zoom. And, you know, with the best will, you don't get the same stories, the same sharing, the same experience that we've had for all them years with the Brittle Bone Society on Zoom. You know, it's when we meet, it's when we get together, it's when we share the laughter and the tears and everything of all them years that we've had at the Brittle Bone Society. And it's just kind of, again, making sure that we continue to capture that in a way that's going to appeal to everyone, so that it's not just our story, it can be shared with other people, and that they understand the value and the importance of it.
Yeah, Yeah, I think that's a really good point on which to end this discussion, because it is, as you said at the beginning, it is your story because it's your memory, your history, but in fact it's everyone's story because we're all living in this society together. And as Ian said, it's potentially affects yes, your story affects everybody, so we should all know about it. So yeah, absolutely, thank you. So I think we'll have to finish there. I'm just going to hand you over to Alistair to say thank you, but I'd like to thank Angie and Ian and Alistair for a really interesting, great discussion there. Alistair?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline, for hosting that. Yeah, really good discussion. I want to say a really big thank you to all the speakers today. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear everyone's talks and such a really good variety of stuff. So I hope everyone's enjoyed that as much as I have. The sessions today, or most of the sessions today, have been recorded. So hopefully they will be up on our YouTube channel in the very near future. So we'll send out a link to everyone in the event once that's been made available. So I think that's everything. Thank you all again for attending. It's been really well attended, more so than I'd anticipated, which is excellent. So I think on that note, I will close the meeting. Thank you all very much.